Hola y bienvenidos a nuestra clase de América Latina Colonial. Welcome to our Colonial Latin American History class. My name is Brandon Morgan, and I'm sure that you have probably watched an introduction video by me elsewhere already, or at least you soon will. I look forward to getting to know each of you this fall semester, and I look forward to working with each of you on the history of early Latin America. This video will just cover a few things about navigating our course and also a few of the key concepts and ideas to think about when studying not only Latin American history, but history in general. So we'll dive into all of those things here. In terms of navigating our course, one of the key things to keep in mind is to always check your announcements when you log into the class. I won't always post announcements, so there won't be one like every day, but I do use them quite frequently. Also, keep tabs on your email, and by and large, just use the syllabus and the modules to navigate the course and make sure that you've completed all the work. So if you just click on the picture, it's from Guaman Poma's accounts of Incan history after the conquest. If you click on that picture, it will always take you to the unit that we're currently working on. So that's, again, the first thing you'll see when you log into the course. Otherwise, you can click on the Modules tab, and you can find the module that you'll need. Right now, I'm still building some of the modules, so certainly the first couple will be all ready on the first day of class. Some of the other ones are still under construction, but as soon as they're ready, they will be open to you. I'm not one that thinks that you shouldn't be able to see what's coming. So in this class, you can work ahead. Please note, however, that there are specific due dates for the assignments. We will be working on blogs, we will be working on Twitter, and we will be working on the discussion board. So that means that if you work ahead, you need to make sure to go back to those things and post the comments as appropriate and as outlined in the assignment instructions. I think that's really all I wanted to say in terms of course navigation. I've tried to put everything, each module, just on one page. So you click on the module, you scroll down to what you need to find. Everything should be fairly straightforward. Whenever you have any questions, please contact me and let me know. I'm always more than happy to help out. Kind of switching gears now and thinking about colonial Latin America. So the title of this course is Colonial Latin American History. One of the things that we need to think about as we begin, this is something that was hammered into my head by Kim Gotterman at UNM, who trained me in colonial Latin American history. Colonial Latin America, if we think of it using that term colonial, it's sort of limiting. And so what I mean by that is the colonial period starts when Europeans arrive. It starts when they come and they start the conquest. They begin to take control of the Americas. Whether we're talking about the Spaniards, which we'll mostly focus on, but we'll also look at the Portuguese. In this class, we won't look as much at the Dutch, the French, and the British, although they will sort of make cameo appearances because we'll, of course, be talking about the hemisphere as well as this region that we know as Latin America. So again, we miss a whole lot of history if we start everything at 1492. And so we need to be careful, again, with the terms that we use and think about what exactly it is that they mean. As we've seen quite prevalently, wherever you stand in today's politics, words matter. I think that has been a common theme across the board, whatever side you're looking at things from. And so again, as we look at colonial Latin America, we need to think about how the terms that we use shape and frame the kinds of stories that we will be able to tell. Power relationships have always been important in thinking about colonial Latin America. The Europeans, of course, were the ones with the power. A better way to think about this course then might be to think of it as early Latin American history. Certainly in this unit, the next unit, we're going to think about what was going on in the Americas before 1492, before Europeans arrived and actually established a permanent presence in the Americas. So I invite you to, again, think about things a little bit more broadly in terms of colonial Latin America, or I should say in terms of early Latin America rather than colonial Latin America. Also, we need to kind of use our historical imagination to think about what it would have been like to be present when the colonization started. And there are different terms that have been used to describe colonization. The term discovery has been used, and that one's been critiqued heavily. Columbus discovered the Americas. I've already mentioned the word conquest. We've talked about colonialism. Other terms that have meant to be a little bit more neutral are things like contact or encounter. All of those have been applied to the initial meeting between Europeans and indigenous Americans that again took place in the late 15th century for the first time. One historian of early Latin America has sort of posited that the only way that or I shouldn't say the only way, but one really beneficial way that we might be able to imagine what it would have been like is to think about what it would be like if visitors from another planet all of a sudden arrived. So of course, if we're thinking about it in those terms, we're looking at an analogy from the perspective of indigenous peoples. What would you think if from the sky, all of a sudden, people from another planet arrived, life forms, beings, whoever they might be? What might that be like? How earth-shattering would that be to our belief systems and our ways of doing things? Also, kind of turning that around from the perspective of those visiting us, or if we were to imagine that we were the ones visiting another planet, if we arrived, the ways that we would describe things would be based on our culture, on our current knowledge. So we might say things like the plants on this planet are green, like ours. They have flowers. Or they might say, unlike ours, plants here are orange. Whatever that might be. They might say that there are dog-like animals here, but they only have 3 legs. So again, what I'm getting at is that you have to use terms that you're familiar with, whether those are cultural terms or terms that you just use to describe the world around you. At this period of contact and conquest, people were trying to come to terms with one another using the toolkit, the concepts that they already had. That caused a lot of talking past each other, a lot of misunderstandings, and especially on the part of those who wanted to assert power and take control, the Europeans, led to a lot of violence. So I think it's important also that we consider the power that the indigenous peoples had, even though they weren't the ones in political power. They often resisted colonial regimes in numerous ways. They worked to maintain their own cultures, their own identities, their own languages. And they didn't lose any of those things. Or I shouldn't say that. They were shaped in certain ways that didn't mean that the Europeans just imposed their way of doing things on the Americas. Indigenous people reshaped the way that European institutions looked. So the colonial Americas, again, although they were Spanish or Portuguese in name and in sort of large-scale jurisdiction, on the ground in any given region and locale, things might look very different in, say, the area around Mexico City, of course, than they would have looked in Madrid in the 16th century. Again, even though all of those were considered Spanish domains. So hopefully what I've done here is just introduced you to a way of thinking about the kinds of problems that we'll be encountering as we study early Latin American history. I want to wrap this video up pretty quickly, but I want it to also connect to the Unit 1 discussion that you'll be doing. So something that I've asked you to do there is to, beyond thinking about primary and secondary sources, and there's a link to a resource that I created that you can use to think about that distinction. Many of you probably already have great ideas about it. The second point in that discussion is to think about the ways in which perspective shapes the kinds of concepts that we might use to talk about early Latin American history. So I already mentioned one of those, the discovery, conquest, colonialism, contact, encounter. Again, think about what different perspectives are embodied in those words. Also think about, who are the indigenous peoples, first peoples, Indians, natives. Again, those kind of all describe the same groups of people, but what perspectives do they embody? Then we have to think about things like transculturation and cultural intermixing when we think about colonization, colonialism, and imperialism. So I've added a slide as I've talked over that last little bit. Use that as the basis for your responses in the first discussion. Also, as we move along, I want you to think about the great diversity and complexity of Latin America early on and still today. So even early on, there were rural versus urban divides. Tenochtitlan and Cusco, for example, Tenochtitlan in particular, was a city that in terms of population and grandeur was much larger than any European city at the time that Cortez and his men arrived. So they were pretty baffled by Tenochtitlan. They were in awe of it, but they couldn't quite figure out how or why people that they thought were backward and savage, and again, those are maybe other perspectival terms that we should add to that category of indigenous people, they couldn't figure out how they could have created such a great civilization, a great city. Latin America has always been also known for natural resources. The colonial system was one of trying to extract resources from the colonies for the betterment of the mother country and the empire. So among the things that were important throughout colonial Latin America were things that had to do with agricultural production, cash crops in particular, like coffee in the Caribbean and North America, tobacco to a larger degree, mining, looking for silver and gold and other precious metals. And of course, if that's the goal, then labor is very important. So early on, systems of coerced labor called encomienda and repartimiento were initiated in Spanish domains to try to, well, not just try to, but to coerce indigenous people into working the lands of the European conquistadores and encomenderos, as they were known. After time, though, African slavery kind of displaced the labor systems that had forced indigenous peoples into working. So we need to think about the distinctions between those kinds of categories as we move along this semester. One last idea to think about is kind of something that points to the difference between Spanish and Portuguese colonization versus British or Dutch colonization, particularly British colonization. So one scholar has pointed out that the Spanish created a frontier of inclusion, while the British created a frontier of exclusion. And that really relates to the ways in which these different people, these different Europeans, thought about indigenous people. So for the Spanish, indigenous people were seen as savages, they were seen as backward, but they were included in society. They were at the very bottom rungs of society that had a caste system that was quite complex, as we'll see in a few weeks. But for the British, by and large, and of course there are exceptions on both sides of this, these are just large models, by and large the British thought we need to exclude Native people completely from our society, push them away, make them move further to the west so that we can take control of their lands. This might not seem like that big of a distinction, but it actually had major implications for the kinds of societies that would develop in colonial Latin America versus the colonial North American context, or what we know as the colonial United States. So again, keep all of those things in mind. Hopefully this will help you just to kind of wrap your head around where we're going this semester, to get a sense of the big picture. I've rattled on a little longer than I meant to. I try to usually keep videos shorter, but this one will be a long one. So please ask questions this semester whenever you have them. I look forward to getting to know all of you and to learning from your insights about Latin American history.